I low-key considered getting a blonde wig just for the thumbnail of this video, but you know, I'm not there yet. I'm not there yet. Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Sarah, and today's video is made in honor of the new Barbie trailer that recently dropped, and specifically this part of it. I thought it was hilarious, and so I wanted to make a video about books related to the theme of death and dying. I'm really excited for the Barbie movie, and I'm sure existential dread is not going to play like a humongous role in this movie, although I'm prepared to be surprised. But yeah, it's a topic that is, I don't know, very fascinating and interesting to me, and very worrying, honestly. I think I've mentioned this in another video that you may have seen. I'm definitely scared of dying, and the thoughts kind of consume me sometimes. It's an anxiety thing for sure. But I find talking and sometimes reading about it really does help, and just getting different perspectives on it. So far I haven't really found any that have helped that much. So I mean, if you also have any fears related to death or dying, and you have any coping mechanisms or just any sort of advice, I would love to hear it. But in the meantime, I would like to talk about some books that I feel like have some themes about death or dying. Some of them are much more obvious than others. I hope that some of these books don't feel like a total reach or anything, because it is a little bit personal and subjective, honestly. I feel like some of these books, very obvious, either the characters have a fear of dying or it's just brought up a lot, and it's yeah, this book is about dying, and people's thoughts on dying. But then there's some other books where I really got, I don't know, the feelings that I'm reading about something to do with the end of life, or worries about the end of life. And so I've included some of these too. They're also just all really good books that I recommend, so that's why I wanted to put them in there. And I would love to make a part 2 of this video as I discover more books, because I don't know, as I was thinking about it, there weren't too many obvious ones that came to mind, but I'm sure many more exist that I just haven't come across yet. So would love to repeat this one day, because again, I don't know, maybe it's not a topic too many people care about or something a lot of people want to read about, but it is for me. The first book is The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy, and I think this is kind of an OG death book. I'm probably not the first, definitely not the first one to tackle this topic, but probably one of the oldest that I have read. I listened to the audiobook of this last year and really enjoyed it. Didn't give me too much anxiety, and you know, when I make these videos, especially about books that I read a while ago, I will usually go back to my Goodreads reviews just to see what did I say about this book? Maybe there's something that's not currently in my head but that I wrote about in the past and that I could use to discuss in these videos. And this is what I wrote for this one. So that's great, very, very helpful and insightful. But honestly, it jogged back a few memories. I was like, oh yeah, that's why I said that. So this book follows a judge, Ivan Ilyich, who lives in a pretty comfortable lifestyle, though he does not have enough money, and he is now suffering from a very serious illness. As his body loses more and more of its faculties, he becomes more distressed physically and emotionally. He only really has one kind of true companion, and that is his butler, because his wife is kind of dealing with how will she get his money after he dies, and she's kind of done with him. It wasn't really a marriage full of love to begin with, and now it is glaringly obvious that it really isn't. Ivan is also quite anxious about his colleagues watching him die. You do see at least one perspective from one of his colleagues, and he doesn't like that people are seeing him like this. This is a man who's never really been very religious, never really thought much about death, but is kind of staring him in the face right now, so he is really thinking about it. So a lot of this book is him thinking back on his life, as well as the present moment. I think the despair and agony in this book are written so well. You do really kind of get to feel how he feels, so much pain and anguish, and it's kind of awful to read about in a sense. And it's is this kind of how I will go one day? I don't love that. Because Ivan Ilyich did not really consider his mortality through much of his life, I think this book really asks us to do that, and probably to live life to its fullest in the best way we can, and to kind of, grapple with these questions about death, dying, and the fact that we're not going to be here forever. This is a really scary thing to do, and I hate it, but I do it a lot, usually kind of against my will. My brain sort of works against me, and sometimes I'm just laying in bed at night and these thoughts just come to me, and it's not fun, but I think having the conversations and having that realization is important because yeah, we're not here forever, and it's I don't know, we need to recognize that as much as some of us might not want to accept it, because I think it can make the decisions we make a lot more meaningful and maybe ultimately help us find the peace that we are seeking for. And this book really does explore that. Can we find that peace at the end? The second book I want to talk about is Concerning My Daughter by Kim Ye-jin, and this is one of the books that is maybe a little less obviously about death, but where I did kind of get slight themes or mentions of it, and I really saw it in this book as well. This book features some elderly characters, and I think it really does kind of ask the questions of, are we satisfied with the life that we have lived? Could we have lived it differently? And what is there to kind of do about that? The narrator is a woman who works in an elderly care facility despite being quite old herself. I believe it's mentioned that she's in her 70s, and she mainly takes care of one patient named Jen. Jen currently has no family or really any friends. She's quite old, but she was a very successful person throughout her life. She had a job that she loved and traveled often, was able to financially support many people, but she never had kids, so there's no one really to look after her, to come visit her. So the narrator is asked by the facility that she works for to kind of shirk her responsibilities and not give as many supplies to Jen, to not change her as often, to not clean her as often, because they need to save money. And it's kind of hinted like, well, there's no one to really check up on her, so what does it matter if she gets an infection or if she's not the most comfortable? The narrator really doesn't want to do this. She doesn't really like shirking these responsibilities. It's very important to her to take care of Jen, and she really sees the discomfort that Jen faces, especially when she is not being cared for properly. And so she kind of questions the administration's decisions to use less supplies and to not care as much. They want to move Jen out of the facility eventually, and she really stirs up some trouble for them regarding that, which is in contrast to another big part of this book, which is her dealing with her feelings around having a queer daughter. The narrator questions her daughter's choices a lot because her daughter, it just inherently goes against the status quo to her because she is in a relationship with another woman. She is, I don't remember if she's exactly a professor or studying to be a professor, but she doesn't have maybe as much of a formal job as her mother would like her to. She obviously doesn't have kids right now. And a lot of this book, and throughout this book, the daughter is attending these protests about a professor that was unjustly dismissed. And the daughter's moved in with her girlfriend, Lane, to her mom's house. Her mom's really not happy about that, and honestly not being very civil to either of them, and especially the girlfriend. And she keeps internally saying and thinking and telling her daughter, like, you can still be married to a man, you can still have kids, you can still like be happy in your life by making these sort of like quote unquote normative choices, which again is really in contrast to like her life as well. She is an older woman, her husband has died, she does not have a lot of money, she's still working, and she did not really find that happiness that she seeks. So there's a lot of contradictions going on here. As she's telling her daughter that she shouldn't be protesting because, well, what's the point? We can't just be going against society in this sort of way. One person or a few people are not going to change anything. At the same time, she is going against her workplace in their treatment of Jen and trying to fight really hard, despite the protests and kind of pushback from not only like her boss, but some of her colleagues as well, who think she's a little bit crazy for doing that. So again, yeah, you see all these contradictions like arising in this book. So while death is not like a main theme in this book, I couldn't help but notice the sort of loneliness that does pervade this topic, especially with some of these elderly characters, some of whom being maybe not in poverty but quite poor now, as the narrator is. And so Jen obviously doesn't really have family or too many people caring for her besides the narrator, who does fight quite hard for her care. But the narrator herself doesn't seem to have many people in her life. She doesn't really have many close friends. She has a very strained relationship with her daughter. Her husband has died, and so you see her as quite a lonely lady as well. And you know, she has to work through these feelings with her daughter, and whether she does or not, that is something I don't want to spoil in the book, but it is something that is quite difficult for her to go against what she believed in for such a long time. But what really kind of worries me is the life of Jen. I mean, she did not have kids. I also don't have kids, and I don't really want to ever have kids. I'm very happy living with my partner. And I feel like I have quite a good life right now, but this is something I do kind of worry about, is when we get older, our friends might start having kids, our siblings might start having kids, and they'll kind of create their own families, and while we will still be close friends with them or still be a family with them, we will not be that sort of like normative nuclear family unit. And so I fear as I get older, like, will I not have anyone around either? I guess it sort of encourages me to maybe try to seek out some intergenerational friendships or just some other friendships with other people who don't want children as well. But it is still a scary thought, maybe ending up in a care facility that doesn't care very much for you. But then even with a character who did have kids, like having these struggles of having to challenge yourself and your beliefs and worldview really, and still being quite lonely despite having made these decisions that you were told will make you happy and do kind of follow society's sort of normative plan for you. It's even doing that, like, you might not be living your fullest life. And again, I think that's why it's important to kind of contemplate that we're not going to be here forever. I mean, best case scenario, we do live quite a long life and don't die from any unnatural causes, but regardless, it's still, you do want to try to live your life to the fullest, which is such like a hokey thing for me to say sometimes. Like, I don't know, I mean, I've struggled with feelings of depression. I've struggled with feelings, like, it's getting a little personal, I guess, but struggled with feelings of not really wanting to be here all the time. And despite fearing death, like, I don't know, you don't always want to be here. It's scary. A lot of things are scary, honestly. But I think it's important to kind of, I don't know, think about it. Like I keep saying, we gotta think about it. But I think overall this was a book that has a really great portrayal of the lives of the elderly, of those who are poor and queer and lonely, and I definitely recommend it for more than just my sort of very personal seeing of like the theme of death. I think there's a lot more to this book than that, but that's kind of a bit what I got out of it, so highly recommend it. So Matrix by Lauren Groff is another book that I don't think has like a huge heavy theme of death, but I feel like it is quite pervasive in it, and largely for the fact that it takes place during the 12th century. There are many deaths that occur in this book. It takes place over a very long lifetime of Marie de France, who is based on a person who did exist, who was a nun in an abbey in the 12th century. Marie is sent from France to England to this impoverished abbey where these nuns are starving, and many of them are on the brink of death, and she is sent there because she has skills to kind of help them. And despite not wanting to go, these skills do help her do quite well in the abbey and eventually take on a much more leading role than she originally perhaps even anticipated. And she becomes quite a motivated character, a motivated person in this book. She becomes respected and loved by many of the nuns there, a little resented too, but for the most part, a lot of her decisions do make things better for the nuns, which is interesting to read about. But things are still hard. Of course, this is the 12th century, and so death is always kind of looming over some of the characters. You learn a bit about Marie's family, her parents, well, rather mostly her mother, her aunts, and kind of how they died, which does kind of come back into the book later on as well. And there's a lot of discussion on nature in this book too. Like, nature features quite heavily, I found. And I mean, in nature there is death, there is always rebirth, there is that cycle, which I mean, I think is so, I don't know, I want to find like hope in that eternal cycle just exists and that we're just part of it, we're part of nature. So I keep harping on how this took place in the 12th century, but it is really fascinating to me that because there was no modern medicine, there was not a lot of knowledge about health and sickness. It is just so interesting to me that people lived through that time, which I don't want to like understate the importance of discoveries that were made in this time across the world, but it does make me like think about how fragile life can be. But despite that, we kind of persevere, as silly as that might sound. Like, there were a lot of characters that kind of come and go. You read about nuns who die throughout the book. Again, this takes place through a lot of Marie's life. I didn't expect it to like go through so much, which I loved. I love books that go through like a whole character's like long life, or not even so long, but many years even. Books that take place within the span of like a year, a month, or even a day are interesting too, but something about like long-term books, I don't know, I love a lot. There are also some spiritual and mystical aspects of this book, which I won't get into too much because I don't remember them well enough to explain them, but I think are an interesting aspect of like a sort of not possibility of an afterlife per se, but a possibility of more than just what we can perceive naturally. And obviously a lot of these characters are religious, they are nuns to an extent, they have some sort of religion or spirituality, so that does play in as well to this book. But overall, this book features a very long and successful life of someone who was quite respected, and I don't know, I think it's something to kind of aspire to, whether you want to be a nun or not, whatever kind of path in life you take. I think it's very cool to read about that and the sort of impact that one's life can have on other people. I feel like I kind of went away from the theme of death a little bit, because it is kind of loose in there, but I did just want to talk about this book because I liked it, and there was a little something there, so that's why I featured it. This next book is a huge favorite of mine. I've talked about it in another video, and that is Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead by Emily Austen. I'm always worried that I'm gonna mess up this title because it's so long, but yeah, this book very heavily features the theme of death, but it's also hilarious, and I love it. I love this book so much. This book follows our narrator Gilda, who is a very anxious person, anxious about a lot of things, honestly, but mostly about death. And this anxiety isn't helped by the fact that she ends up getting a job as a receptionist at a Catholic church, despite not being Catholic and being a lesbian, so not having a great relationship with the church, only to find out that the previous receptionist who held this position has since passed away. So that is very much weighing heavily on her mind. And even more so when she starts getting emails from this dead receptionist's friend who doesn't know that she died, and she's really not sure what to do, and should she go along with it or should she tell her? She really does not want to be the bearer of that news, especially since she did not know this receptionist before. So Gilda's anxiety about death definitely make her think twice about a lot of things. It keeps her awake, and I don't know if that is exactly what gets in her way of making meaningful friendships or relationships or kind of being able to go out and be social. That might just be another part of anxiety for her that is not necessarily related to death, but I think it all does kind of go hand in hand. And yeah, she really does struggle with different kinds of relationships. She doesn't have the best relationship with her parents. Her relationship with her brother is a little bit weird, not totally strained, but there are certainly issues that both of them kind of have to work through, and her brother has to work through his own issues as well. She's sort of seeing somebody that she met on a dating app, and it's very I think she's scared to kind of put effort into making this a real relationship, because I think she's scared of a sort of abandonment or not being good enough for this person who does seem to care about her and want to spend time with her. You don't really get to know a lot of Gilda's friends either, honestly. They do kind of feature in this book, at least one of them does. But it seems like she's very detached and going through a lot as well, being poor, having this one weird job now that she is hiding from everyone, honestly. And yeah, it's a lot is going on in this book. And Gilda makes a lot of decisions that at times I want to kind of just scream at her and be you don't have to talk to this person, you don't have to go out with this person, why is this giving you so much trouble? She has a hard time saying no. But then I'm I've also probably done these things before. I also have a hard time saying no. I also have certain anxieties that lead me to make somewhat irrational choices. I mean, she's visiting the hospital so much because of all these little worries that she has. The janitor at the hospital knows her now. Everyone's a little bit annoyed with her for kind of wasting their time. But you can't really help being anxious about certain things being wrong with her. This book was really funny to me. I thought it was very, it was hilarious, and I reread this quite recently, and it was just as funny, if not funnier, the second time around, which I think is very important because there is a lot of not sad, but kind of difficult and unfortunate stuff going on in this book to Gilda, and stuff that is relatable. And I kind of hate the word validating, but it is validating to read about knowing that someone else kind of feels this way. I don't know if the author necessarily feels this way herself, but she definitely presented a realistic story of someone who does. I feel like this book kind of fits into that kind of I don't know, sad girl book that I was talking about in another video, where the main character is a woman in her 20s who is unemployed or doesn't like her job and doesn't have a lot of close friends or has very strained relationships, and there's just something going wrong. But I think which I don't think it's a bad thing to have a book like that. I enjoy books like that, honestly, for the most part. But I do think that there's a bit more in this conversation about death and anxiety in this book that I personally think are presented quite well. And so I recommend this book like hardcore. And lastly, a book that I have also talked about before and want to talk about forever, White Noise by Don DeLillo. I have really loved this book ever since the first time I read it. I've read it once or twice since and loved the movie when it came out last year. So I'm always recommending this one, and I did not expect there to be such big conversations about death in this book. I knew a little bit about this book before reading it, and I knew that it was going to be featuring some big disaster, a lot of themes of consumerism and family and kind of what we do in the face of these things, in the face of disaster, particularly how we act as consumers and members of society. But I did not know that there was going to be so much discussion on death from a lot of the main characters. So that was like a pleasant surprise for me. This book follows a professor, Jack Gladney, and his family, his, I believe, 4th wife, and their 4 kids, all their kids from different marriages, which I think is a very interesting sort of take on the nuclear family, because initially they do come off as a very normal nuclear family, like the very typical family you think of. Then you find out that these are kids all born from different marriages. Some of them are Jack's kids, some of them are his wife Babette's kids, all from different marriages, aside from one child who is both their kid. So that's really interesting too. There are other kids that feature in this book too that kind of come in, but there are 4 main ones who live with them. So you have this typical but not so typical family, and a lot of their like consumerist habits as well. The white noise in this book is, in my opinion, very prevalent. Like, you see it in a lot of their conversations. Someone's always talking. There's always something on the radio or on the TV. There's billboard, there's shopping, there's so much going on in this book. So among all these distractions, all this white noise, all this talk of consumerism, they're always like going shopping or going to the mall. It's like this revitalizing activity for a lot of these characters, which I think is another sort of interesting commentary that I would also love to get into more one day. Honestly, I want to make like a deep dive into white noise, and I have for a while, and maybe I will at some point. But yeah, amongst all these like distractions, there are a few characters in this book who are very scared of dying. And these conversations end up coming up, and initially one, but eventually both of these characters go to pretty big lengths to try to get away from that fear of dying. I think there's an understanding that you can't get away from dying one day, but they want to try to alleviate the fear because it does keep them up. And you know, there's parts in this book where they both sort of say like, oh, you know, I don't want to, like this couple in particular, the main couple are saying like, well, I don't want to outlive you, like I hope you live longer than me because I would be devastated without you. And there's a sort of back and forth about that, but ultimately one of them does admit like, no, like I'm scared of dying, like I don't want to live without you ever, but I don't want to die either. And for me that was very real. I don't like the idea of outliving my partner, outliving my friends. I think that would be a very lonely existence, like the one I talked about in Concerning My Daughter. But at the same time, I don't want to be the first one to die either, if there's like a sort of first one, if that makes sense. And I think these sort of conversations really get at that. Like, I'm just talking about books that I found super relatable, but they're also really great books. I have to, I guess, mention that there is a sort of unnatural disaster that kind of happens, this toxic cloud that takes over their town and kind of pulls them out of that distraction of the white noise. But for one of the characters only furthers their anxiety of death later on. But yeah, this toxic event really sets off a chain reaction to a lot of things that later happen in the book regarding death anxiety and other anxieties as well. I think, and I said this in a previous video, I believe that it does really speak to kind of how we adjust and have to kind of like adapt to these big, scary, like both natural or unnatural events that are happening to us on Earth. And you know, we hear about these natural disasters or other disasters, and like you hear about it, maybe you experience it, and eventually you either get used to it, or once it goes away, you kind of try your best to forget about it, even though it could happen again. And you see that a lot of being particularly around climate change. I think that's a big one, but other like man-made things too. I think we try to do like a good job of ignoring these because it's very hard to kind of face. And I think the same thing can be said for death. It's a very hard thing to face. These characters, despite talking about it, don't want to be thinking about it, don't want to have that fear, and that kind of drives a pretty big plot point in this book. Anyway, I love this book. I feel like there's so much more that can be said about it. I feel like I never explain it very well because there's just a lot that kind of goes on, and it's a bit of a mess. And when I first started this book, I thought it was a bit obnoxious. It's considered like a postmodern work of writing. It's very satirical, which I ended up loving a lot and finding hilarious. Like I thought this book was so funny, but when I first started reading, I was like, this is kind of stupid, or like this is like too much. But I ended up liking it a lot, so I hope people give it a chance because it does kind of come off pretentious. I think that's the word I'm looking for. It does come off slightly pretentious in the first few chapters, especially if you're not used to reading literature like this before, which I very much am not. But it has definitely become one of my like top 5 favorite books, I think, if I had to rank them. And yeah, big theme of death in here. Hey, post video creation editing Sarah here. I realized when I was talking about like the fear of death and all these books and stuff, I never really talked about why I'm so scared of dying. And I don't know, maybe it's like obvious, maybe there's only like a couple reasons, but I felt like if I want to connect with people, I should like mention it. I'm really just kind of scared about the nothingness that I assume comes after you die. I'm a little spiritual, but I'm not very religious. So yeah, I just don't think there's really anything after you die. And if you have a belief system that is different than that, then that is great. And maybe I hope to develop something like that one day, honestly. If not, just like cope with what I think is kind of the reality of death and dying. But yeah, that's kind of it. It's not even the uncertainty, it's because I just feel like I'm pretty sure I know. And I don't mean that in like a conceited way. I don't know, to me it just seems like what else could there be? Because I just don't have like a sort of faith, and I used to, and it kind of made me feel better, but I don't know. And I'm not an atheist. I definitely feel like there's something, or like there might be more than just what we can see or understand currently. But when it comes to dying, I don't know. So that's mostly why. And yeah, it just feels like all this work that I'm doing, like learning new things, learning history, learning new languages, reading so much, like what's it for? And obviously like it's for bettering ourselves now and hopefully bettering things for people in the future. Like I do strongly believe that that is something we need to do, and I have taken part in various movements, very much want to make things better for oppressed people and workers in the future. And that's kind of where some of my other like passions lie, besides just reading. So I think that's very important, and that is something we are here to do, and hopefully there's like a cause or something you are also passionate about. And I hope I try to maybe kind of get across that when I was talking about, I think, Matrix or one of the other books, that it's important like to be a good version of yourself, trying that, as well as working with other people and trying to make things better for everyone, trying to create change in this world to affect future generations. I think that's really important. But it still doesn't always make me feel better that like I won't be around to see that. And I think it's beautiful that there are people who just don't care, who are working on things that might never, like, they might not ever see the result of that, whether it is some sort of social movement or like some creating something else. But yeah, I don't know, it just scares me so much. And again, if you've ever had that fear, please let me know how you maybe got over it or how you kind of cope with it. I'm still quite young, so I'm hoping that maybe it'll just get easier as I get older, but who knows, maybe I'm worried it'll get even worse, honestly. And I just try not to like think about it a lot of the time. But yeah, I don't know. I know some other people have fears just related to like leaving people behind, or to that kind of like uncertainty, and I get that too to an extent, but for me it's just being pretty sure that there is nothingness waiting for me. And yeah, I kind of hate that a lot, so I just wanted to kind of clarify that. Maybe I sort of like mentioned it a little bit, but I don't think I talked about it too much. So anyway, back to the video, wherever I decide to put this. Alright, so this is my sort of list, recommendations of books on death and dying. These are all books I enjoyed a lot, so I wanted to recommend them. And I would love to make a part 2 to this video one day, because I'm sure there are a lot more books with this theme, with these discussions, and I have not read most of them. Like I said in the beginning, it was kind of hard for me to really think about what books had this this like sort of theme or like mention even of death, and that's maybe why it might sound like I'm kind of reaching with some of them, but I really was like having these thoughts when I was reading these books, so I thought it would be good to mention and just throw in some other recommendations. I would also be really interested in reading some nonfiction books on death. I think that might be helpful for myself, and I mean, let me know if you are someone with that anxiety, if reading any sort of nonfiction sources or watching any sort of videos on it has been helpful. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you appreciate how I connected the Barbie trailer and the theme of death and dying, because I got very excited when I saw that and wanted to, I don't know, it gave me inspiration for this video, honestly. Looking back, I should maybe have this idea a while ago, but it wasn't really until I saw that trailer that I was like, yeah, I'm gonna have this discussion and I'm gonna wear a pink Barbie dress while doing it. If you also have this anxiety, I would love to talk about it more. If not, then honestly that is great for you because it sucks. But yeah, I'm always interested in reading more about this topic, and both fiction and nonfiction. So yeah, one more time, thank you again so much for watching. If you liked this video, please like it and leave a comment on any thoughts on these books that I talked about. If you have recommendations for me, I would love to hear them. And yeah, see you in the next one.